Mark Twain once quipped, "For every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and long." With that in mind, John and I gave resolve. On balance, a one-day national primary would be more beneficial to the United States than our current presidential primary process. Part 1 is the framework. The most fundamental aspect of democratic governance is voter education. Elected officials handle every question of policy facing the United States, and in a democracy, the supreme authority to elect these policymakers belongs to the people. Thus, the only method by which we can ensure beneficial policy decisions are made is by electing the best decision makers. This can only occur when voters are sufficiently knowledgeable about our candidates' policy stances. The Cato Institute explains, quote, "Political ignorance significantly worsens the performance of democracy. There are numerous cases where American voters have committed terrible mistakes because of political ignorance." Jeff Kimball elaborates on how this occurs, stating, "With uninformed voting, the results of elections are influenced by voters whose criteria for making a selection is as insightful as flipping a coin. A person who does not vote, exercise judgment, dilutes informed votes, and as a result provides a disservice to our society at large." End quote. Part 2. A national primary would severely reduce voter education. This occurs in two ways. Subpoint A, a shorter primary process results in a shorter primary process reduces voter deliberation. Thomas Patterson writes, in the national primary, it would be significantly reduced in length from the current 18-month campaign, and as a result, diminish the importance of campaigning. This would harm voter education, since voters would have less opportunities to make thorough judgments. Heather Frederickson explains, when primaries are drawn out, there's empirical evidence to show that voters learn information about candidates that allows them to make more informed decisions. Subpoint B, a national primary allows candidates to ignore local issues. Chad Flanders finds that local concerns would be ignored because candidates would have to focus on the entire nation at once instead of one state or region at a time. Issues such as crop subsidies for Iowa farmers would be subordinated to other national issues, and as a result, fewer issues are highlighted and voters don't know the stances of the candidates on issues that matter to them the most. The current system allows for candidate disclosure on local issues, and as a result, leads to a more informed voting electorate. Part 3. A national primary undermines grassroots political activity. John Fortier explains that the early contests in small states promote grassroots politics, candidate meetings of citizens face-to-face, and immersion in local political culture. A national primary, however, would undermine grassroots activity for three distinct reasons. First, because of the expense of a national campaign. Danielle Kurtzenblend writes that a national primary would make deep-pocket donors and name recognition prerequisites to success. Instead of focusing on ads in Iowa, a candidate would have the whole nation of media market to hit at once. This means a less funded candidate who can stand a chance in the current system would be at a huge disadvantage in the national primary. Second is the sequential nature of campaigns. The AGS writes, the dark horse winners in early states can continue to gain momentum among voters, coax more small donors, and build name recognition between primary contests. In a national primary, however, the AGS writes, this sequential momentum is lost. Third is the law of diminishing returns. The American Prospect explains that in a one-day national primary, well-funded candidates would enjoy an amplified advantage because the marginal benefit for every ad is higher in a system where you have lower number of ads per voter. So for example, if you've heard 50 Hillary ads but only 25 Bernie ads, you've probably made up your mind based on the message, and that 51st Hillary ad isn't going to make that much of a difference with regards to how you vote. But if all of a sudden the media market becomes national and Bernie can only put up 3 to Hillary's 6, that 7th Hillary ad has a much higher marginal gain for the campaign, effectively meaning that richer candidates are effectively helped. The impact is less choices for voters. Chad Flanders writes that a national primary is a disaster in terms of preserving candidate variety. Crowding out grassroots candidates means that there are fewer voices in the conversation, and as a result, even if voters are knowledgeable about what they want, the limited field of candidates prohibits an application of that voter knowledge. Sadly, those voters find themselves choosing between the lesser of two evils. Thus, increased turnout becomes useless. For these reasons, we are proud to stand in the negation of today's debate, and urge you to as well.
Can you see the American Prospect? No.
American Prospect.
There's 11 seconds.
Everybody ready? Sam and I affirm resolved, on balance, a one-day national primary would be more beneficial for the U.S. than our current presidential primary process. Our standard is positive policy change because that's what benefits the United States as to affect people's lives. Our first contention is on boosting political participation. The modern primary has notoriously low turnout. For example, according to Bipartisan Policy Center in 2012, the 2012 primary had 17% turnout. This is true for a few reasons that a national primary would solve. First, according to the Pacific Standard Shannon Markovitz in 2014, because every state has different dates for presidential primaries, few voters even know when the primary election will take place. A one-day event, by generating media buzz, closes the knowledge gap and generates more enthusiasm to vote. Second, according to the University of New Mexico's Lana Atkinson in 2008, thanks to our sequential system, many voters outside of the first voting states don't vote, not only because they feel that their vote doesn't matter since the election has already been decided, but also because candidates don't pour much voter mobilization money into later states. The first impact is increased legitimacy. For instance, Victoria Scheinman finds in 2013 that because voting leads people to believe that they have a stake in the political process, on average, being mobilized to vote increases trust in the system by 10 percentage points and internal efficacy by 13 percentage points. The second impact is reduced factionalism. Markovitz continues, those most likely to vote in low turnout primaries are highly educated, wealthy, and politically active homeowners who are very ideological. Brookings Elaine Carmack thus concludes in 2016, moving to create a national primary day is the one reform that could close the enormous gap in voter turnout and reduce the chances that one or both political parties get captured by factions that increase polarization and lead to dysfunctional governance. Our second contention is on making every vote count. The current system gives vast gatekeeping power to the voters of Iowa and New Hampshire, who vote first and whose votes set the media narrative for frontrunner status, and thus they have the power to decide who drops out and who survives. NHGR Steve Cosello writes in 2015 that the disproportionately white, rural, and ideological early states affect the type of candidates available to voters in later states, perhaps even what candidates choose to run in the first place. Moreover, Elizabeth Skews of the University of Colorado finds in 2007 that the New Hampshire primary generally gets about 10 times the amount of coverage of any subsequent primary election, meaning that even when candidates are not explicitly pandering, the issues confronting the early states are still vastly overrepresented. As a result, Brown University's Brian Knight quantifies in 2010 that voters in early states have 5 times the influence of voters in later states. There are 3 impacts. First, it harms democracy. According to Knight, this disproportionate power represents a deviation from the democratic ideal of one person, one vote. Second, it distorts policy. The New York Times' David Leonard explains in 2016, early voting states receive more federal dollars after a competitive election and get other concessions like the infamous corn subsidies. More significantly, Leonard writes, the predominance of Iowa and New Hampshire distort the national conversation. For example, Clyde Haberman in the New York Times says the first 25 debates of the 2008 election never mentioned urban issues, despite the fact that that affects 80% of the population. And Harvard's Edward Glaser writes in 2008 that candidate positions on broader issues like guns and immigration have been skewed to represent rural interests. Most significantly, Galvin writes of Northwestern writes in 2014 that because parties often follow their nominees on ideology, this hijacking of what it means to be a conservative or a liberal extends beyond just the presidency to congressmen, think tanks, and local officials, thus warping government in ways people cannot even notice. Third, it weakens the candidate pool. The early states dominate so much coverage that they effectively get the power to decide who survives the later primaries. As a result, the strongest candidate often loses because he or she does not appeal to the earliest states. As a result, Knight's study concludes that simultaneous systems outperform sequential systems in selecting candidates that best align with the interests of voters, and thus Sam and I are incredibly proud to affirm. No further for us.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. Ready to go?
Absolutely.
Last call. So you talk about in your first point, 2012 had a really low primary turnout.
Yeah.
Why did you pick 2012?
Not this election. When I cut that card, the whole thing wasn't over yet.
Okay.
It
was over, however, on the Democratic side, wasn't it?
It was because President Obama was the incumbent.
Exactly. So might that be a really good explanation for why they had a historically low turnout?
It was Republicans. We were looking at the primaries. It's a competitive
You just said that
primaries.
you were looking at 2012 on both sides.
I don't believe I ever said both sides, but I can call up the card for
You
you.
said you were looking at the 2012 Republican, or excuse me, you said you were looking at the
I
primary.
can
and
call
now
up whether it's looking Republican or not.
I believe that you can look it up, but I'm not sure you're going to find something that satisfies you.
No, I mean like I can provide you the card to verify
Yeah,
whether
I'd
it's
be happy to look at the card later, but I
Okay.
doubt that it's going to
I have a question for you about your voter education.
Go for it.
Ought we have literacy tests?
No, not that we have literacy.
But if voting when you are ignorant is a disservice to the nation, that seems like a pretty logical extension.
But it bites into your framework, right?
I'm
Your
talking
framework
about
is-
the logical extension of your framework.
No,
Leave mine
sure.
later.
Sure. So, first on mine, the problem with what you said just now about literacy tests is that prohibits people from voting. We're not trying to prohibit people from voting, but we're not trying to encourage people who are going to cast bad ballots to vote.
But wouldn't
You see
have
the
it
difference? They
not-
still have the
would
right.
not
They still
require-
have the right to do it.
Wait,
right?
wouldn't not requiring literacy tests encourage people to vote? Or all
It
these
doesn't
other
encourage.
things?
It prohibits.
Wait.
Literacy tests are discriminatory. We're just
Yeah.
trying not to spend money
Well,
on people who
I
are
would
going to
contend
cast bad
caucus-
ballots. Now, do you mind if I ask you about your framework?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome, thanks. So you talked about in your framework making good policy decisions, and that was the standard for democracy, right?
No, it's a standard for benefit to the interests of the United States.
Okay, sure. So with that in mind, don't you think you have to elect the best policymakers to do that?
Well, it matters what they're representing. So electing the best
Sure.
policymakers is a way to get access to it, but we contend
Okay.
you need to identify specific policy. I have a question
So
for you
wait,
about
so
local
if we
issues.
wait, so just to finalize on that,
Yeah.
if we're able to link in to electing the best policymakers, we're able to access your framework of making good policy decisions
No,
and good
here's why.
decisions for America
Because even if you get the best president, even if you get the best president,
and Congress.
well, how are you? Okay, I'm going to go with the
By
point about
using
how
voter
you.
education.
But they're not running for Congress.
You
Okay.
need to. So, like in 15 states, they're on the same day.
In 35 states, they're not. You
Yeah,
have a very weak
exactly.
link there.
It's
Here's
more
the
of a link.
argument
It's more
here.
of a link than the
So-
link that you're talking about, which
Wait,
is none.
Wait, the argument is, unless you can
We're
identify the
solving for at
policies,
least
you
50
don't
states.
have
You
the
solve for
link.
0.
Okay, we're going to dispute that, and that's the point of speeches. I have a question about local issues. How much influence does the president have over specific local issues?
A fair amount. I mean,
Like-
you complained in your speech just a moment ago that they didn't focus on urban issues facing
Yeah.
cities. That seems
Right,
like a
but that's
municipal problem.
generally urban
That seems like a
issues,
municipal
like
problem.
I would say.
But if you're
flood
talking about
controls.
urban issues
No.
being problematic and the presidents need to take a stand on it, then that also substantiates our claim that local issues are
No,
important and
I
they're
mean
being
when you
ignored by
say local
candidates.
issues, you mean specific local issues. For example, the Purple Line in Montgomery County, the electrical distribution network in New Hampshire.
I'm also talking about building a dam off of a community up in North Fort Bend.
Yes,
the point is,
the president does not
that-
have the power to
but
create
that's a
dam.
federal funded dam. That means he has
president
to
does
sign
not
off on the
have-
budget.
Yeah, the president is not going to do a line-item veto because it's illegal
He'll
about
look-
over a dam.
Of course, they
The
don't
president has
reject it
to-
over excess in funding if he doesn't support that project.
No.
Yes.
Alright, can we see the evidence for the second
Yeah,
impact on contention too? Can we see the evidence for that?
Yeah, hold on.
Like more federal dollars.
Oh, Leonard? You want both?
Which you,
The one about how more federal dollars are used.
they just want more federal dollars.
Okay,
I heard off on that.
See, yeah, here. Yeah, and if you want bipartisan policy, I'm gonna start doing that. That's the turn.
Thank you.
That's the issue. It's best.
Stop that.
We have our
Yeah, sure.
board now, so we're.
Alright, so for my judges, obviously going down the affirmative case, we'll start with Frank.
So first comparing framework as to which one makes more voter education for positive policy change. We control the internal link into positive policy change through the Cato Institute and Jeff Kimball cards. It says that if voters aren't informed, that means it's going to create bad policy, and there's tons of examples in American history. He's very specific. One of them is that it literally caused the Great Depression because people had ignorance of basic economics and voted for this smooth tally-terror. So we control that internal link through positive policy change, and we're going to prove how turnout does not do that. And unless they prove education, we'll clearly win framework. Let's start on contention when they talk about turnout. Firstly, if the early influence actually dissuaded voters from feeling represented, we'd see decreased decreases in late state turnouts. The fact of the matter is we don't. According to a U.S. election project, and we actually looked at the most recent elections, not 2012, if you look at the 50 states in order in terms of turnout, the turnout rate does not decrease at all. In fact, it remains exactly even. We'll show you the graphs and the data. And Jewett corroborates with warrants. He says that as a result, turnout for states in the uncompetitive phase of the presidential nomination remains relatively high because voters come because their statewide primary races are occurring at that time and because they want to send a message with their votes. Secondly, status quo solves turnout. According to the Pew Research Center, Republicans and Democrats in their highest of any year since 1980 in terms of turnout right now, which means this goal is solving. And third, on simplification, specifically that one, the primaries are already a media event. The Pew Research Center also notes that 91% of all Americans were aware of the primaries within the first week of voting. Then let's talk about the impacts. First, you can turn the impacts. This is going to be the most crucial turn in today's debate ground. Uninformed voter turnout harms democracy. Cato Institute and Jeff Kimball proves this, but John Fund proves this even more when he says the root cause of avoiding the ballot box is apathy and disinterest, which means increasing turnout unless you're increasing education makes bad votes. Then let's look at polarization, which is another impact. Firstly, increasing turnout won't do anything about voter preferences or extremism. According to the British Journal of Political Science, an exhaustive analysis, they found that simply flipped, voter preferences will differ minimally from those of all citizens. Meaning, if everyone voted, the ideal turnout on their side, outcomes would not change. Here's the reason why. Tons of extremists like third-party candidates or libertarians don't vote. Tons of moderates do vote right now, as much of the literature wants to act like they don't. Then let's talk about disenfranchised minorities. Firstly, minorities have huge influence as well. The Washington Post says the first 4 states, don't let our opponents cut it off, at the first 2 states do a very good job of representing and creating momentum, and they are not only diverse regionally, but also racially. South Carolina has a majority of African Americans in its Democratic electorate, and Nevada has the same with Hispanics. In fact, that makes it easier for them, according to the New York Times, which says that Obama won the 2008 nomination partly in the fact that minorities are concentrated in certain areas. In a national primary, minorities are always the minority. But if you go state by state, the minorities can gain momentum for people because they're actually concentrated in those places. It happened with Obama in 2008. That was an example of empirical evidence. Let's look at attention to. Let's talk about how early states have an advantage. Firstly, to bring up Brian Knight. There's a reason this card's really bad. It's because he concludes that voter education is critical. In his own words, in our view, the key distinction is that sequential, that's the con side, elections provide late voters with an opportunity to learn about the desirability of various candidates. Voters in later states have more information under a sequential system and thus presumably make better choices. That solves their framework. It's all about positive policy change, right? Then, let's talk about how it's empirically not true that they have all this influence that they talk about, even though the study's wrong as it is. It's empirically not true. Look at 2008 and 2016. The last 2 contested Democratic primaries where there wasn't an incumbent, we saw went all the way down to the wire, especially 2008 with Hillary Clinton and Obama. But secondly, empirically, winners of Iowa and New Hampshire often actually lose the nomination. On balance, it cancels out. There's 6 examples in the last 20 years. Then third, this is a huge turn on the second contention. Later state votes are wasted, even if educated, if the field is too narrow to represent their views. Thomas Gangle writes that campaigns will be waged through national media, making sure that candidates without personal fortune would be eliminated from the race before it even starts. Beth Chapman continues and gives the same warrant. So, if we can prove that grassroots candidates are taken out of the election, then there's no way they can win one person, one vote, because that means those people that were enfranchised in these later voting states can't even vote for someone they like. Moreover, on their impact about one person, one vote. How is this an impact if their framework they gave me is positive policy change? That sounds like an abstract democratic ideal, not something that has to do with their framework. Don't let them try and gain offense off that. Then finally, you can turn it because the national primary creates a new inequality for small states. Beth Chapman says they'll only focus on big states with rich delegate counts and not small and medium-sized states. What that means is that we're just moving from one system, wasting a bunch of political capital, and moving to a system with an even bigger equality because there's no responsibility for the candidates. That responds also to their argument about how there's more federal dollars because that one was also is replied by that warrant. For all those reasons, it should be a clear con ballot. Thank you.
Yeah, I need some food. Thank you. Alrighty, since I am going to thank you, doing a lot of time for that. It's going to be on framework first, then down their case, and then defending our second contention specifically. Okay? So, let's start our framework. My opponents say that we should be looking to voter education first. The problem with this is the reason why you should for our framework is the justification for why they say voter education matter. They say, quote, this is because how beneficial policy decisions are made. This is the quote. If the ultimate goal is to have beneficial policy decisions made, why not just cut out the middleman and just look to whether or not beneficial policy decisions are made? That means that's why you should be preferring our framework. Let's go on to the first contention, which talks about decreasing education. The first warrant talks about how it's going to be a shorter campaign season. But this isn't going to be true in the real world. Because small candidates know that they need a lot of time in order to get their message grassroots out there, they are likely to start campaigning well before the national primary. This shorter campaign season does not exist. But second off, they say that there's going to be more information, but the information they get from the sequential system is not necessarily useful information. That's a distinction my opponents actually never make. In fact, I would argue the information they get doesn't help inform the decision. One is because, as Christopher Akins of Princeton University explains in his book, that when people get the information during the primaries, they just use that to rationalize the choices they already made. It doesn't make them actually make a more informed choice. But second, Peter King of 538 explains that people get information for early states as to which candidate is the front runner, and as well they have this bandwagon effect, which means you might get more information, but that information makes people worse voters, which turns my opponent's entire framework against them. Then they talk about how it's going to lead to ignoring local issues. First, as my brother alluded to, a crossroads, the point where presidents have more power over national issues, local issues are going to be less important. But second, keep in mind there's another side to this coin. What Andrew Taylor of NC State explains is that in fact, because they're focusing on local issues under the sequential election, they ignore national issues, to the point where that means that voters are less informed in national issues. We win under their framework. Let's go on to the next intention, which talks about grassroots. First, this doesn't link into their framework at all. You buy their framework, don't vote off this argument. But then they give you this 40-year analysis saying in earlier states, this is immersion culture of leading the candidates. But this isn't true in the real world. But Andrew Smith of University of New Hampshire explains that contrary to the myth, 85 to 90% of voters never meet a candidate even in New Hampshire, which has a ton of retail politics. Most of it already is in the media. My opponent's impact is not unique. Now let's go on to some more specifics. First, you talk about how the expensiveness of the campaign is going to increase. That's simply not true in the real world. The reason is right now there's a lot of inefficiencies in the way people fund their campaigns. The problem is, as O'Connor of Wall Street Journal explains, you know what known as mixed media markets. There's people buy lots of ads, for instance, in Iowa, but it's also shown in Illinois, who doesn't have a primary. So as if they waste a lot of money. Because you smooth out these inefficiencies, saying that if Grenoble or Purdue University finds a sequential election is 60% more expensive than a national primary. That's going to turn my opponent's entire impact against them. Then they talk about how the sequential election leads to a momentum effect that could seed the link into our second contention about the early states get too much influence. Then they talk about the diminishing returns, that there's going to be fewer votes, fewer ads per person. But the point is that's only true if the total amount of spending goes down. If we prove that spending goes up, we also turn this against them. Then they talk about Flanders, how we need to have lots of voices. But the point where the only voices that we hear right now are the candidates who are able to appeal to rural states. By having a national primary and have people can appeal to urban issues in the conversation, we have more voices and therefore more voter information. Let's go on to their attacks into our case. First, on this idea of equal states is our second contention. First, the first four states are pretty diverse because of South Carolina and Nevada. The problem is the Brookings Institute actually analyzes this and finds that not only is Iowa and New Hampshire significantly more important, so that doesn't matter, but also he finds if you average together demographics, it's still disproportionately white. It is an analysis you should be voting on. Then they talk about how voter education, that the Knight study said that voter education is really important. He does say that. However, he still says in his conclusion that voter welfare improves under a national primary. That means our own author does the weighing analysis for you and tells you that we should be outweighing this idea of for more information. Then they say that under the current system that it goes down to the wire in the most recent elections. Not only is this a cherry-picked example, and the fact that right now technically it went down the wire, but Hillary Clinton had really convincing elections beforehand, to the point where they could see the link in their second one of their second contention that said there's a lot of momentum effects from the early states. They are still conceding the link. Then they say that's too narrow to represent everyone's views because they're going to be eliminating all these candidates beforehand because they don't have the funds. But to the point where it's more expensive under the existing system, we actually turn against them. Then they talk about how there's going to be leading to this inequality for smaller states. There's two reasons why this is unlikely to be true. First off, because it's more expensive to campaign in dense media markets, because for instance New York is really expensive to buy ads, a financially prudent candidate will likely to be campaigning in smaller states as well. But second, to the point where candidates have a competitive advantage campaigning in states where no other candidate is campaigning, what happens is they are likely to focus on smaller states. We turn all their turns against them.
Ready? So you firstly attack our part 3 by saying that there's no link to our framework, right?
Yes, that's the first attack.
Okay.
Yes.
So if we're limiting grassroots candidates and they're not in the race in the pro world, say I want to vote for a grassroots candidate and I have a lot of education, aren't I not applying my voter education and thus it's linking into voter education?
Wait, so is most voter education occur before the primary process begins? Is that what you're saying because you're an educated voter?
It depends.
Most?
I would say it depends. It depends on the election. It's different every time. I
So-
can't tell you like 6 education points occur.
No, that's not wasn't really my question. What I'm asking is, your question there is predicating on this idea that an educated voter is a better voter. Does that
Yeah.
mean that most voter education occurs before the election season starts?
I would say in a national primary, that's the
No,
only
in
time
general.
voter
In
education
general. No,
can
under
occur.
sequential election.
Under a sequential election, it occurs throughout the entire process.
Which is more important, before or after the second?
It depends. In your process, it would
In
reduce
under,
education.
under a sequential system. So the defense doesn't work here. Under a sequential system, which
Depends
is more
defense is the
important?
only way to answer your question because it makes no sense. right? You're asking me, I told you it's different in every election, and on your side, it doesn't
Okay,
make a
so if
difference.
it's different in
All right,
every election,
we seem to be focusing on
then-
this issue too much.
well, I want
Let's
to.
move to something else. I want to use our crossfire effectively, don't you?
I would, and I'd like to get a word out, and I
That's
think
fine.
that's the most effective way
Get a
to
word
use
out.
crossfire. What we're saying is that if voter education primarily occurs before the primary process, then that is not going to be a benefit of having a sequential election where you're saying the only information you get is during the actual
My
after
answer to your
Iowa
question,
starts.
this is why I was careful, because I knew where you were going. It only happens before in a national primary. In the sequential system, we learned from
So,
these
but
candidates.
then-
We read 2 different cards that told you that in part 2, contention
So,
A.
question,
The Frederick's card and the partner card.
The reason-
I can't do much more work on this for
But
you.
the
Let me
reason-
get into question now,
I'm
please.
a little
All right.
confused there, but okay.
So you argue that the impact won't occur because they can appeal to rural areas, right?
They will be appealing nationally,
Sure.
yes.
And you made the argument that rural areas are less diverse, correct?
We did. We would say they would
Okay.
campaign in proportion to their population.
Okay. Then on the other side of the flow, right?
Which side of the flow are we on now?
We're on your side of the flow.
Thank you.
You talked about more expensive media markets in New York, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Which of those populations is more diverse?
New York is more diverse.
Okay.
However, the point of this argument is not to say that they will ignore New York, because you make a pretty convincing case that they will focus on New York. We're saying that there's a balance here, that you're offsetting the fact that there's more people there, but it's also more expensive. So in fact,
Let's
what
talk about
happens
diversity.
is they're likely to focus on it in proportion to their population.
Let's talk about diversity. You're prioritizing the diversity of rural versus urban, right? Wouldn't you
we're
say
talking
urban
diversity
areas are the
actually
most
overall.
diverse?
I would
Wouldn't you
say
say that urban areas are the most diverse?
Visually, yes, and I think that is one of the reasons why we need to be looking nationally and not just to Iowa and New Hampshire.
Right.
But most importantly, this idea of diversity, we're looking at when you talk about interest, there's interest in the racial diversity, also socioeconomic diversity, how the economy is like. That's why you can't just have a few states at the front.
That's fine.
We're gonna run some crap, but before that, I'd like to see the 60% card, please.
You're finagling.
Awesome.
Is it open? It is open.
Highlighted.
Scroll up the abstract.
Can you stop that? There was another card I wanted to see that seemed kind of important. You said it would smooth it out and make it 16% less expensive.
60. No,
16.
No, 60. That's the number. 60, not
Oh, I
60.
think it's 60. Maybe it's not, that seemed good. Okay, we keep going. Where does it say 16 in here?
60. 60.
Okay, okay.
That's it's highlighted.
It's fine. Alright, we'll stop at that. I should have 17 minutes.
Sorry, I gotta read this line off. I just have to. Do you mind if I borrow this next week?
Yeah, sure.
Alright, is everyone ready to go? Okay. Just as a brief roadmap. I'm going to be touching on framework, and then I'm going to focus on the negative side of the ballot, and then move over to the pro. Everyone's good to go? We'll begin. Judge, they give no internal link to how we're going to create better policy changes. They just say they cut out the middleman. Without a link to that argument, then we control the internal warrant. And the internal warrant is having a more educated electorate. At that point, you're going to be buying our analysis on the framework. So, with that in mind, we jump onto the first contention. They try to turn our argument by bringing up the bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is no more causation than correlation. The whole idea of the bandwagon effect is that if you win early, you win late. But the idea there, in essence, the idea is a good candidate will continue to win. and a bad candidate will continue to lose. That pattern continues not because of some bandwagon effect, but because good candidates win and bad candidates lose. And when it doesn't happen, that's an anomaly rather than what's supposed to happen. So then on our second argument about grassroots candidates, they try to bring up the turn about how 85% never meet the candidate at all. One, it's not specific to Iowa and New Hampshire, where we bring up how grassroots candidates do campaign. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, they try to bring up the 60% card, but then read the 60% card on page 15. They say comparison of the two treatments informs us that the aggregate expenditure is lower in the sequential cost relative to the simultaneous cost. That is a direct quote from their study. I had to read it to you. It wasn't part of the highlighted section, though. So then when we move over to the third argument they made against our case, they tried to argue diminishing returns was only about the more amount of money, but now that we've disproven that using their own study about how there's more money involved, you can now extend the argument about diminishing returns, and national campaigns are more expensive. Now, on less choice and less knowledgeable to be obliged to the impact, they try to argue that you must be able to appeal to urban centers. Two responses. First, more people live in cities, so that means that delegates are able to balance out the importance of early voting states. That's why you don't see urban issues being ignored. Second, they try to disregard our local issues point at the top of the flow with the argument that local issues aren't delegated by the president, and so at that point, they can't argue that urban issues need to be taken by the president. Then, on their side of the flow, you can extend the term that my partner put on their New Hampshire, Iowa 2 important argument about that a minority is not always a minority in this system, because when you go to South Carolina or Nevada, you have to talk about black issues, you have to talk about Hispanic issues. You're confronted with either talking about them or losing, and at that point, the candidates are forced into a bind where they're forced to take a position on those stances, when on a national stage, they're no longer able to.
Walt, back if you're back.
You got it.
That was, I don't know how much work that was. Just say 10, 15, 10.
I got you on 130.
Yeah, that's fine. The internal link we have to better policy is eliminating the distortions. The reason why you prefer this framework is because there's just one link in the policy distortions, cut out the middleman, and just look to other policy distortions. They missed a couple terms on voter education, which they think is important. One from Aikens that says the information you get from Iowa and New Hampshire doesn't lead to more education, just needs you to rationalize the choices. No response made. Secondly, we talk about the bandwagon effect. These signals you get out of Iowa and New Hampshire just are about who's better based on Iowa and New Hampshire's preference. They're not good signals. They say this is just correlation, but he's saying is that the way in which people see the information coming out of New Hampshire is distorted by the media, such that you're not getting better information. On local issues, we say as a result they ignore national issues, which are more important because you actually see that the president can affect and affects more people. They have no link into education on their side. On this about leading candidates. They say they do meet them. In New Hampshire, which is the #1 place where there's retail politics, almost 95% never meet them, so it's a myth. On this irrefutable evidence, they read the hypothesis. They say we hypothesize it'd be cheaper. No, the conclusion says it's 60% more expensive on a sequential system. They don't know how to read a study. That takes out all of the responses they made. They're functionally lying about the evidence. On our voter, which is about equal votes for equal states, they say, well, you have like South Carolina balance it out. They missed the response that Sam makes that says even when you take that into account for Brookings, that still doesn't balance the distortions that Iowa and New Hampshire face. And secondly, because they spend 3.5 times more money in Iowa and New Hampshire, it doesn't balance out. Here, then they come up here and say, a lot of people live in cities. The urban issues are not local issues. Like national urban issues, for example, gun control still apply. Two big places. Then they talk about these small states and more people going to leave. We say it's going to be decreasing small state influence proportional to the number of people that live there, and they're not going to ignore them because it's cost effective for them to campaign there. This is a competitive advantage. Two places we weigh here. One from Leonard. This is the national conversation is distorted when you have Iowa and New Hampshire come first. That is a stronger link into the kind of voter education they talk about. But secondly, on our framework, we directly tie it to policies like corn subsidies and things that emerge and more federal dollars going to early states, which is the strongest link to the policy and distortions that we contend is the most important for the interests of the United States.
Do you mind if I have the first question?
Yeah.
All right. So how do we access the link of like policy distortions, right? If more people aren't turning out.
So you think turnout's now the most important issue?
No, I'm just talking about if you want to access your offense, wouldn't have to be with higher turnout, right?
No, it would be about the national conversation, right? That's our link.
What do you
that
mean?
the national conversation shifts to rural issues and Iowa, New Hampshire issues.
No, I'm talking about on your side of the case, not on our side.
Sorry?
I'm talking about on your side of the case, right?
I don't.
One of your impacts is that it's going to create more, it's going to decrease polarization, and past that,
We
you
don't
said,
go for our first contention.
That's our first intention.
no, I'm not talking about your first contention. Going back to the second contention. Can you access those policy distortions that link into your framework on positive policy change if there's no increase in turnout?
Yes, we can link that.
How?
That's because it's about the influence of the states. You could have theoretically,
So it's
you could have
influence of states, that's
theoretically
fine.
the same turnout. However, if all candidates are focusing on Iowa, New Hampshire, they pander more to Iowa, New Hampshire. That's why we see 3.5 times more money spent in Iowa, New Hampshire than South Carolina, Nevada, and 2.5 times more visits.
Okay.
That's why they're pandering more to this interest, regardless of turnout. That's why we see these policy distortions. Can we ask you a question, though?
Go for it.
Which I'll hand this off to my brother.
Yes. You say that your response to Smith is other states, but even though 95% of New Hampshire people never see the candidate,
No, when you
other
read the
states
card,
do.
you said 85 to
To
90% of the
95%,
nation, and then you said
no, of
especially
New Hampshire, which is the state
That's
that
just
is
like,
most
I remember
likely.
exactly what you said.
I always of New Hampshire.
Okay, so what is the point that you're trying to make?
If the states that have the most retail politicking, the most meeting the candidates, has basically no meeting the candidates,
No, it's
how
not
widespread
95%
is this
of the
issue?
state, but bear in mind that only half of the state is going to be a Republican or Democrat, and only
No,
a
never
portion of
means
that
any
is going to
candidate.
vote, and
Any
only a portion of that is
candidate.
going to vote.
Also, one of the
Republican
reasons this
candidate.
argument wasn't a big deal in the first place, because the access to the impact, which is that they have less choices because grassroots candidates are hurt, is because in those areas they don't understand the local issues of the grassroots candidates, or the grassroots candidates are hurt. It's not about meeting them face to face, it's that the grassroots candidates are
You
weeded
said
out.
You said personal contact is what you mentioned before. Your
Personal
that was the
contact isn't the link to the impact.
That was
though.
the context for the response.
That's not the impact, that's not the link to the impact though.
That's why there were other responses.
Okay, so you were talking about, at one
I'm sorry I
point,
beat that.
minorities, you're talking about minorities trying to have a voice. And we bring up that minorities will always be the minority on the national stage. And I extend that term that Jed made from the New York Times. I was wondering, doesn't that have to play into the media narrative too that you talk so highly about in your framework?
Yeah, here's why. One, the status quo is in those cases is it the majority because people don't care about the kind of
They're the majority. They're the majority in
Secondly,
South Carolina in the
people are
Democratic
still
primary.
looking
They
at
are.
One,
They
especially
are.
in the Democratic and
55%. 55%.
Yes, I understand that.
Okay,
Here's
cool.
the important point, okay? There's two things. One is that when Brookings averages them together, he finds it still disproportionately white.
No,
the first
yeah,
one
if
is-
you
but-
average it
but-
together, the nation, that's what makes them
No,
a minority.
but,
They're in the
however,
minority.
here's more, no, he says it's disproportionate still.
No,
Of the
yeah, it's
nation.
disproportionate
However,
because they're
here's the most
in the
important issue.
minority.
Hold up.
The argument that we're making is when
Hold
they're
up.
concentrated in
Hold
area,
up.
candidates are confronted with that issue and they have to talk about it. Doesn't it link into your framework? That's my question.
No,
Why not?
because
we're way out of time.
Okay.
We just ran out.
That's a 10 seconds on my clock.
I was just
Alright, so for the judges, start with framework and give voters the main areas.
The only access link they have to their actual offense is if turnout increases on these issues. That means if we control the internal link to the education, if there's no increase in education, that means they won't access the impact of one person, one vote, or that the candidate pool is better, or that the factionalization is occurring. That's why it's more important to look towards our framework. Let's start at turnout and see the places we want. Firstly, the U.S. Elections Project, this was unresponded to. Turnout does not decrease in larger states because the people are still want to go to send a message. Secondly, if turnout does increase, there's a huge turn on that because voters right now, the number one reason they don't go is because they're apathetic or disinterested. That means sending them to the polls only makes worse positive policy change. That term is never responded to. That's huge because we're generating more offense because they're creating bad policy because uneducated voters are now going to the polls. Third, we killed polarization. That impact is gone because right now if everyone votes, as I explained with the British Journal of Political Science, that it wouldn't change policy outcomes. Then, let's look towards the turns on their second contention. The first one is that votes are wasted. If we win the grassroots point, that proves that the votes are wasted if there's no grassroots candidate that you can vote for, because at that point, there is no one that aligns with your views. We win grass points are back on our side of the flow because of law of diminishing return. That was never responded to. Once we won that link, the impact was that now they have less choices and they can't apply that voter knowledge. It's clear as day they didn't attack the impact actually correctly. Then secondly, we also gain offense on their side of the flow because we made the influence turn for minorities. Because minorities are concentrated in these certain areas, minorities minorities actually have more advantage in our system because candidates can gain momentum off those early states. Then third, on local issues. They said that the reason we're going to win local issues is very clear. The only arguments they made about local issues were that presidents don't have to deal with them, which Francis Pugh's disproved. And then secondly, on the argument of local issues, they said that in the future, it's not going to matter. But the fact of the matter is, local issues determine what the candidates tell their stances to those people, so they actually are responsive to those local issues. And if they're not, those voters don't get the education on the stances. That internal warrant was never replied to, so we're winning local issues. Lastly, on media coverage. The only arguments they made are being about bandwagons, but as Franz brought up in the summary, for bandwagon candidates, this isn't true because these 4 states that have influence, people can still lose after winning those states, and the reason those good candidates are winning those states is because they're good. So those are informed votes after. It is not causation, it's correlation. For all these reasons, it's going to be a clear con ballot. Thank you.
You have a minute 30 remaining with Will and judges. Okay. Starting this idea of framework, but they say we should look at education first because that's the strongest link into policy distortions. However, to the point where there's other links to policy distortion, for instance, who goes first, we should be looking more holistically. That's why we should look to policy distortion overall first in this round. However, I want to make this very clear. I'm going to show you why we went under either framework. Let's talk briefly on the terms on their case. First, on this idea of education, they entirely dropped the ACIDS analysis that says that the information you get from primary just helps people rationalize their choice. Doesn't mean they have more informed choices. That takes out the response. On the idea of information about local issues, where that's not useful information because the president doesn't have much power, it's pretty much irrelevant. But more importantly, to the point where Taylor says it distracts from national issues, that means voters are less informed because they're less informed about the issues that actually affect people the most. On this idea of grassroots candidates, they say this was law of diminishing returns because there's fewer ads per person, but to the point where we show you from Erfanoglu, who actually in their conclusion, not in the hypothesis which they cite, which is actually disproved in the study, they find that when the cost goes up by 60% under their system, we're going to be seeing this, the argument just simply is not true. More voices are crowded out under their world. Talk briefly on turnout. They give you terms about the harms of increasing turnout. The point where they say turnout doesn't increase. This isn't relevant in the round. Let's go to the more important issue, which is equal voice for equal states. They say our internal link is that we need turnout to go up. No, the internal link is that every state has equal influence and that candidates focus on every state equally. Then they say that minority interests are still going to be represented because they're more concentrated in states like South Carolina and Nevada. But the reason why that isn't true, as Will points out, is that candidates don't focus on states like South Carolina very much. For instance, they spend 3.5 times more money in Iowa and New Hampshire than in South Carolina and Nevada. That means we're still seeing this policy distortion away from ones that actually help the most people. Here's how this outweighs under our framework. One, we give you from Leonard that tells you specific policy distortions like federal money going to these early states and things like corn subsidies. They have a possible risk of some policy distortion. We're telling you 100% chance we have policy distortions when you vote for them. But here's how this outweighs under their framework. When Leonard says that these early states distort the national conversation, that leads to worse voter education. And when candidates who don't appeal to rural interests and urban interests can't succeed, that means the overall electorate is less informed because their voices aren't heard, which means we win under either framework, and that's why I think that you should affirm. Thank you.